Throughout history, there's been one universal truth that connects every civilization, every empire, and every era. The rich have always existed, but what it actually meant to be wealthy has changed so dramatically that a modern billionaire's lifestyle would seem alien to ancient pharaohs, and a medieval king's daily routine would baffle today's tech moguls. If you think being rich today means private jets and luxury yachts, wait until you discover what wealth looked like when owning a single book made you richer than most nobles, or when having ice in your drink was more valuable than gold. We're about to journey through time and explore the most insane ways the ultra-wealthy have lived throughout human history. From pharaohs who were literally buried with fortunes that would make Jeff Bezos jealous, to robber barons who controlled entire industries with a single handshake, the definition of being rich has evolved in ways that will absolutely blow your mind. And here's the crazy part. The wealth gap between the rich and poor today is actually similar to what it was over a century ago during the most unequal period in American history. That means we're living through a repeat of one of the most extreme wealth concentrations ever recorded. By the end of this video, you'll understand not just how the wealthy lived in different eras, but why their lifestyles were so vastly different from what we see today. You'll discover the shocking truth about which historical period produced the most unequal society in human history. And trust me, it's not what you think plus. I'll reveal how modern billionaires stack up against the richest people who ever lived, and the results might surprise you. Let's start our journey in ancient Egypt, where being rich meant something completely different than today. Picture this. You're living around 1400 BC during Egypt's 18th dynasty, and you've just been born into the pharaoh's family. Your daily life would revolve around one simple fact that gold is literally as common as dust in your world. Egyptian miners had perfected techniques for extracting gold from the eastern desert and Nubia that were so advanced, other civilizations referred to Egypt as the place where gold was more plentiful than dirt. But here's what made Egyptian wealth so unique compared to every other era. The pharaoh wasn't just rich in the way we understand wealth today. He was considered a living god, which meant his riches had divine significance that went far beyond material possessions. When Tutankhamun died, he was buried with a solid gold death mask that would be worth over $4 million in today's money. And here's the insane part. Tutankhamun was considered a relatively minor pharaoh. Imagine what the truly powerful rulers were buried with. The wealth of ancient Egypt was built on something that seems almost primitive by today's standards, but was absolutely revolutionary for its time. The Nile River's predictable flooding created the most reliable agricultural system the world had ever seen. This wasn't just about having enough food. The surplus crops generated by Egypt's agricultural machine allowed the pharaohs to fund massive construction projects, maintain enormous armies, and accumulate gold reserves that dwarfed every other civilization. What's fascinating is how concentrated this wealth was. While the pharaoh and his inner circle lived in unimaginable luxury, most Egyptians existed right at the poverty line. The wealth gap in ancient Egypt was so extreme that the pharaoh's income was roughly 46,000 times greater than a simple swineherd's annual earnings. To put that in perspective, that's like comparing a modern billionaire's wealth to someone making $20 a year. The lifestyle of Egyptian elites was built around religious ceremony and divine authority. Their palaces weren't just homes, they were temples, where earthly wealth merged with spiritual power. Gold wasn't just valuable because it was rare. It was sacred because it represented the sun god Ra, making every golden artifact both a display of wealth and a religious statement. Fast forward about 2,000 years to medieval Europe, and the concept of being rich had transformed completely. During the height of feudalism around 1300, wealth wasn't measured in gold reserves or agricultural surplus. It was measured in land, people, and political power. If you were a feudal lord, your riches came from controlling every aspect of your serfs' lives, and I mean everything. Medieval wealth was justified through a combination of religious doctrine and philosophical arguments that would seem absolutely insane by today's standards. Theologians like Gilles de Rome argued that economic inequality was the natural result of hierarchy between men, while others claimed that the social order was literally God's chosen system. This wasn't just about having more money. The wealthy believed their riches were divinely ordained. Here's where medieval wealth gets really interesting. A king's income during this period was approximately 7,000 times greater than an unskilled laborer's earnings. But unlike Egyptian pharaohs who accumulated physical gold, medieval lords built their fortunes on something much more complex. They controlled the feudal system itself, which meant they owned not just land, but the people who worked that land and everything those people produced. The medieval wealthy lived in a world where banking and capitalism were just beginning to emerge. This created moral dilemmas that sound surprisingly modern. How much wealth was too much? When did accumulating riches conflict with spiritual salvation? These questions plagued medieval society because the new economy was creating unprecedented fortunes, while traditional religious teachings warned against greed. But nothing in medieval Europe could have prepared the world for what was coming next. The Industrial Revolution completely shattered every previous understanding of what it meant to be wealthy. We're talking about a transformation so radical that the richest people in medieval Europe would look like peasants compared to the titans who emerged during this era. Between 1800 and 1900, something unprecedented happened. European societies became what economists call genuine rentier societies, where wealth concentration reached levels that had never existed before in human history. Great Britain, Sweden, and France became the three most unequal countries that had ever existed on planet Earth. In Great Britain, the top 10% of society controlled 91% of all national wealth. Let that sink in for a moment. 9 out of every $10 in the entire country belonged to just 1/10 of the population. Sweden wasn't far behind at 88%, and France hit 84%. These weren't just rich people. These were wealth concentrations that defied everything humanity had seen before. Paris became the poster child for this insane inequality. Between 1810 and 1910, the wealth controlled by the richest 1% of Parisians jumped from roughly half of everything to 2/3 of the city's entire wealth picture. Walking through Paris during this time and realizing that almost everything you could see, from the grand boulevards to the magnificent buildings, was owned by an incredibly tiny slice of the population. But here's where things get absolutely wild. This period of extreme inequality was actually interrupted by one of the most devastating events in human history. The Black Death pandemic that hit Europe between 1347 and 1352 didn't just kill millions of people, it completely reset the wealth distribution across the continent. For about a century after the plague, inequality actually decreased because so many people died that the surviving workers could demand higher wages and better conditions. It was literally a pandemic that accidentally created more economic equality. Then we jump ahead to America's Gilded Age, and this is where wealth reaches levels that make modern billionaires look almost modest by comparison. Mark Twain coined the term Gilded Age because he saw through the thin veneer of prosperity that masked the incredible suffering of the working class. But for the people at the top, this era produced fortunes that were absolutely astronomical. John D. Rockefeller became so wealthy that his net worth, adjusted for inflation, would be around $400 billion in today's money. That's nearly 3 times what Jeff Bezos is worth at his peak. Rockefeller didn't just own an oil company, he owned roughly 90% of all oil refineries and pipelines in the entire United States. Imagine one person controlling 9/10 of America's entire energy infrastructure. Andrew Carnegie made his fortune in steel. But what's fascinating is how these Gilded Age titans viewed their wealth. Carnegie genuinely believed that rich people had a moral obligation to give their money away. He called it the gospel of wealth, and he wasn't just talking about charity. He was arguing that accumulating massive fortunes was only acceptable if you spent your later years systematically giving it all away to benefit society. J.P. Morgan took this wealth concentration to another level entirely. He didn't just own businesses, he essentially owned the concept of American capitalism itself. When other wealthy people needed money, they went to Morgan. When the government needed financial backing, they went to Morgan. He was so powerful that his personal financial decisions could determine whether the entire American economy succeeded or failed. Henry Ford revolutionized not just manufacturing, but the entire relationship between wealth and workers. He paid his employees $5 a day, which was double what other manufacturers offered, and he limited their work to 8-hour days and 5-day weeks. This wasn't just generosity, it was strategic brilliance. Ford realized that well-paid workers would become customers for his cars, creating a cycle where wealth generated more wealth. These Gilded Age fortunes were built on something that seems almost impossible today. Complete monopolistic control over entire industries. Rockefeller controlled oil, Carnegie controlled steel, Morgan controlled finance. They weren't just rich, they were the infrastructure of American capitalism itself. The lifestyle these people enjoyed was beyond extravagant. They built mansions that rivaled European palaces, threw parties that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime, and traveled in private railroad cars that were essentially mobile palaces. But what made them different from today's wealthy was the scale of their control over American society. Now here's where this story takes a dramatic turn toward the modern era, and the parallels are absolutely shocking. Looking at wealth across these different eras reveals something absolutely mind-blowing about human nature and society itself. From Egyptian pharaohs who were buried with fortunes worth millions, to medieval lords who owned entire populations, to Gilded Age titans who controlled 90% of entire industries, the ultra-wealthy have always found ways to accumulate power that seems almost impossible to regular people. But here's the most shocking revelation from this entire journey through history. Today's billionaires are living through a repeat of the Gilded Age. The wealth gap right now is roughly as wide as it was over a century ago when robber barons dominated American society. We're witnessing the same extreme concentration of wealth that created the most unequal period in modern history. The difference is that today's wealthy control information, technology, and global markets instead of oil, steel, and railroads. But the fundamental pattern remains exactly the same. A tiny fraction of people control massive portions of society's total wealth, while everyone else fights for the scraps. What's really wild is that this cycle keeps repeating. Throughout history, wealth concentrates, society becomes unstable, major societal disruptions happen, like a pandemic or a war, wealth gets redistributed, and then the whole process starts over again. We're currently living in one of those concentration phases, and if history is any guide, something's eventually going to shift the economic landscape. The question isn't whether this cycle will continue, it's what the next reset will look like and whether we'll be ready for it.